November 1887, Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory. The first thing you noticed was the smoke, not the thick, desperate columns rising from every cabin in the valley below, where families were burning through their winter wood at a pace that would ruin them by February. Just one thin thread, pale as a whisper, rising from a dark opening in the hillside and dissolving into a sky the color of old pewter. From the trail below, travelers dismissed it without a second thought. Another failed claim, another family that gave up and moved on, leaving behind a hole in the earth and maybe a broken tool or two. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked twice. But if you had stopped, if you had climbed that frozen slope and pressed your hand against the timber frame around that dark opening, you would have felt something that made no sense. Warmth, not the desperate, fluctuating warmth of a fire being fed constantly by exhausted hands. Something steadier, something older, the kind of warmth that did not ask anything of you. It just existed. And inside, while the temperature outside had dropped to negative 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and every family in the valley was burning their reserves and praying for a break in the cold, Mildred Dunmore was sitting at a small table in her shirt sleeves, writing in a notebook by the light of a single lantern. She was 34 years old, medium height, broad-shouldered from years of physical work, with hands calloused in the specific way of someone who had used tools since childhood. Her hair was pulled back practically, not elegantly. There was nothing about her appearance that invited a second glance. That was in many ways exactly the point. She wrote the temperature in her notebook, 61 degrees Fahrenheit inside. She had last added wood to the fire 6 hours ago. She closed the notebook, set it on the table, and went to sleep. That is the story. Except it is not. Not yet. Because to understand what Mildred Dunmore built into that Montana hillside in the autumn of 1887, you have to understand what she had already lost, what she had spent 4 months doing the mathematics on in her head during the worst nights of the previous winter, and what it cost her to be the only person in the Bitterroot Valley willing to believe that the answer was already there, waiting in the earth beneath their feet. You have to start at the beginning. Mildred Webb grew up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the only child of Clifford Webb, a carpenter who had spent his entire life building things for other people and who had quietly, without ceremony, decided that the fact of having a daughter instead of a son was not going to prevent his knowledge from surviving him. He started teaching her when she was 12, not the simplified version that adults sometimes offer children as a kind of condescension dressed up as education, the real thing, how to read wood grain, how to calculate load-bearing capacity from the dimensions of a timber, how to identify the precise point where a joint would fail before it failed. He taught her the way a craftsman teaches an apprentice, which is to say, he let her make mistakes and then made her figure out what had gone wrong. She learned something else from him too, one rule that he repeated often enough that it became the background noise of her childhood. Before you put anything into the ground, ask the ground what it wants. She did not understand what he meant by that until she was 30 years old, sitting in the dark beside a fire that was dying too fast, listening to her daughter cough. Mildred married Cyrus Dunmore in 1882. He was a good man in the way that the word good actually means something, not as a polite way of saying unremarkable. He was honest, steady, genuinely kind to his daughters in the particular quiet way of men who express love through presence rather than declaration. He was a farmer by training and temperament, which meant he understood soil and weather and the long patience of growing things. What he did not understand and had never pretended to understand was construction. That had never been a problem in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, Mildred's skills were a domestic peculiarity that people mostly chose not to notice, the way a community will accept an unusual arrangement as long as it does not require them to say anything about it out loud. Cyrus built fences and tended crops. Mildred built the house additions and repaired the barn roof. Nobody discussed it at church. In the Bitterroot Valley of Montana Territory in 1885, the situation was different. They arrived in April with a wagon loaded with tools, seed stock, and the particular optimism of people who have committed to a thing too completely to afford doubt. The valley was genuinely beautiful in the way of places that are trying to kill you, slowly green and wide and threaded through with cold, clear water, surrounded by mountains that look like a painting until November, when they looked like a warning. Their first summer was hard but manageable. Cyrus broke ground on 30 acres. Mildred built the cabin, a 16 by 20-foot structure with log walls chinked with moss and clay, a stone fireplace, on the north wall a shake roof, a raised plank floor to keep moisture out. She built it the way her father had taught her, correctly, following every principle of proper frontier construction that she knew. It looked exactly like every other cabin in the valley. It performed exactly like every other cabin in the valley, which meant that when November arrived, it was cold. Not the kind of cold that is merely uncomfortable, the kind that is a slow emergency you spend months trying not to look directly at. The fireplace demanded constant feeding. Within hours of the fire dying down, the interior temperature would drop 30 degrees or more. By morning, ice formed on the water bucket near the wall, not outside near the wall, inside the cabin. Alma, who was 5 that winter, developed a cough that would not quit, a wet, rattling cough that went deeper than a childhood cold had any right to go. Mildred kept both girls bundled in wool even indoors, because the alternative was watching them shiver. She burned through her entire woodpile by February. She spent March cutting frozen timber in temperatures that made the axe handle feel like it was made of pain, hauling it back on a sled and then watching it smoke and spit in the firebox, because green wood in deep cold burns, wrong burns, inefficiently burns through your patience faster than it burns through the cold. April came. Alma's cough faded. The family survived. Mildred did not feel relief when the snow retreated. She felt something closer to calculation. She had spent 4 months doing arithmetic in her head during the long nights of feeding the fire, and the numbers she kept arriving at were not survivable over the long term. 6 cords of wood per winter, just to keep her family barely comfortable, and comfortable was not even the right word. Barely functional was closer. 6 cords meant 2 full months of labor dedicated to nothing except fuel. It meant that every February would carry the specific terror of watching your reserves disappear faster than the calendar could justify. It meant Alma's cough was not a fluke. It was a forecast. And worst of all, sitting beside the fireplace On one of those long, cold nights, Mildred had noticed something that would not leave her alone. She pressed her palm against the stone of the fireplace. An hour after the fire had died, the stone was still warm, not scorching, not even very hot, just warm in the way of something that had absorbed heat and was releasing it slowly, steadily, without drama into the room. She left her hand there for a long time. Stone held heat, not forever, not indefinitely, but significantly longer than the air around it. The stone was doing something the cabin walls were not doing. It was storing. She thought about her father's rule, asked the ground what it wants, and then she thought about the ground itself. The following morning, January 14th, 1886, the temperature outside was 15 below 0 Fahrenheit. Mildred put on her coat and her boots and went outside. She found a spot a few yards from the cabin where the snow was thin over rocky soil. She got down on her knees and started digging with a hand tool, pushing through the frozen crust. The first 6 inches were iron hard and deeply cold. Below that, the soil was still frozen, but less violently so. She kept going. At 18 inches, the soil was merely cold, not the bone-deep cold of the surface. She pushed her bare hand down into the hole she had made and held it there. It was cold, but it was a manageable cold, a stable cold, not the murderous cold of the air above it. Cyrus was watching from the cabin window. He did not come outside. He did not ask when she came back in what she had been doing. He trusted that she had a reason. That was one of the things she valued most about him, his capacity to trust her reasons even when he did not understand them. But there was also something else in his expression. When she came back in, something she had seen before, a careful neutrality that she had learned to read as a kind of interior negotiation he was conducting with himself. She understood it. The valley was not Lancaster County. Here a man was measured by what he built and what he decided. Having his wife be the one who made the structural decisions carried a weight that he never complained about and never entirely put down. She did not ask him about it. She had her own arithmetic to do. By June of 1887, Mildred had made a decision that she understood would make her the most talked about person in the Bitterroot Valley for reasons that had nothing to do with respect. She was going to build her next shelter into the ground. She chose a spot 300 yards up the slope from the cabin on a south-facing section of hillside with good drainage, rocky but stable soil, and a clear line of sight to the valley below. The exposure mattered because winter sun, even weak winter sun, hitting a south-facing opening would provide passive heat gain during the daylight hours. She told Cyrus her plan on a warm June evening after the girls were in bed. She laid it out the way she explained everything specifically and without decoration, the depth of excavation, the roof construction, the thermal logic. Cyrus listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. "Are you certain?" Mildred considered it honestly. "I'm certain about the physics," she said. "I'm not certain about a number of other things." Cyrus was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. He went to bed. The next morning, Mildred woke before dawn and went out to begin marking the excavation site. When she came back inside 2 hours later, there were 2 good shovels leaning against the door that had not been there when she left. Cyrus was already in the fields. She looked at those shovels for a long time. Then she picked up the better one and went to work. Mildred began digging in July. The work was exactly as hard as she had expected and exactly as necessary. She excavated 12 feet into the hillside, creating a space 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep. The back wall and both side walls were raw earth cut clean and vertical. The front wall, the only face exposed directly to weather, would be timber and stone with a single door positioned for practical entry and one small window angled to face south and catch the low winter sun. The roof was the most critical piece of the construction. Mildred built a timber frame first, then covered it with split shakes, then a layer of canvas soaked in pine tar for waterproofing. Over the canvas went 12 inches of living sod cut from the hillside itself, grass roots, intact soil, packed tight. The weight was considerable. The insulation value was higher than anything a timber roof could provide, because she was not insulating against the cold so much as she was incorporating the cold's opposite into the structure itself. Inside, she dug the floor down another 18 inches below the main excavation level, then laid a foundation of flat river stones across the entire floor area. Nothing decorative, just thermal mass beneath the feet of anyone who would live there. The walls she left as bare earth, but she carved narrow ventilation channels near the ceiling, angling them up and out through the sod roof to allow moisture to escape and prevent the interior from becoming a root cellar rather than a home. The fireplace sat at the center of the front wall, built from the same local sandstone she had used in the cabin, but this firebox was smaller than standard, and the chimney was taller. Every stone she chose for it was selected for its density, its capacity to absorb heat and hold it. It was during the roof construction in mid-August that Clementine Haynes appeared. Clementine was a widow of 55 who lived in a small house half a mile down the valley, the nearest neighbor Mildred had. She was not a woman who explained herself, which Mildred had always appreciated. She climbed the slope on a Tuesday afternoon, stood at the edge of the excavation, and watched Mildred work for 20 minutes without saying anything. Then she said, "You're not worried the earth will come down on you." Mildred set her hammer down and looked at the walls she had cut. "If I've done it right, no." Clementine considered this. "And have you done it right?" Mildred looked at her evenly. "I'll know when I'm finished." Clementine nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing information away. She turned and went back down the slope. Mildred watched her go and then went back to work, assuming that was the end of it. The next morning, Clementine appeared again at the top of the slope. She was carrying her own shovel. She walked down into the excavation without asking permission and began moving earth from the area where Mildred needed it moved. Mildred watched her for one moment, then she turned back to her own work. That was how the two of them built their trust, not through words, through the decision to show up and do the work that needed doing without requiring an explanation or an invitation. There are people in the world who understand that language. They tend to recognize each other without being introduced. It was that same week that Pastor Malachi Redmond became a problem. Redmond was 52 years old with the careful manner of a man who genuinely believed that his convictions were the same thing as wisdom, which made him more dangerous than an angry man because he was not motivated by malice. He was motivated by certainty. He saw Mildred at the general store in late August when she came down to buy rope and hardware, and he asked with real concern in his voice whether Cyrus knew about the construction project. "He does," Mildred said, "and he approves. He brought the shovels," Mildred said. Redmond studied her. "That isn't quite the answer I was asking for. It's the only answer I have." She paid for her rope and her hardware and left. She did not think much about the conversation until that evening when Cyrus came in from the fields with a particular expression she had learned to read over 6 years of marriage: careful, neutral, working something through. Redmond came by, he said. Mildred was already expecting it. "What did he say?" "That he was concerned about your health, the physical demands." Cyrus sat down at the table. "He talked to me, not to you." Mildred set her mending down. "I know." A silence grew between them, not hostile, but weighted. Cyrus looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "He came to me because he thought I was the one who should be deciding." "Yes." "And I let him talk for 10 minutes, and then I told him the shovels were already in the ground, and I didn't see what there was to decide." Mildred looked at her husband. He was not meeting her eyes, which meant he was not entirely comfortable with what he was telling her, which meant it was true. "Thank you," she said. Cyrus nodded. He picked up the book he had been reading the night before and did not bring up Redmond again. But Mildred thought about it after he was asleep. She thought about the fact that Redmond had gone to Cyrus, and that Cyrus had had to decide what to do about that, and that the whole transaction had happened in a space she was not part of, about a project that was entirely hers. She did not feel angry about this exactly. She had grown up enough to understand the difference between what was fair and what was real, but she noted it in the same way she noted temperatures and fuel consumption and the precise angle at which a ventilation channel needed to slope. Information. She would need it. The work continued through September. Amos Norwood stopped by in the 3rd week of that month, which was significant because Amos Norwood's opinion carried genuine weight in the valley. He had been homesteading in the Bitterroot since 1878, longer than almost anyone, and people listened to him not because he sought authority, but because he had demonstrated year after year that his judgments were worth something. He stood at the entrance of the excavation for a full minute with his arms crossed, taking in the dimensions, the roof construction, the stone floor Mildred was laying. "You're wasting good timber on that roof," he said finally. Mildred kept laying stone. "How so?" "Because you'll tear it down in a year when you figure out you can't live in a dirt hole. No light, no air, damp as a spring cellar. Your girls will get sick." Mildred set a stone, carefully checked its level, then looked up at Amos. "What does the best timber roof in the valley do for you after the fire's been out for an hour?" Amos paused. "Keeps some heat in for a while." "How long?" he considered honestly. "Hour, maybe 2 if the wind's not bad." Mildred pointed at the earth wall behind her. "I'm building something that will keep heat for 6 hours after the fire dies. The earth doesn't let it out the way timber does. It holds." Amos looked at the wall. He was silent for a long time, and she could see him working through the logic of it, the physics of it, and finding that he could not immediately refute it. That was the problem. You could refute a woman who was being sentimental or impractical. You could not as easily refute one who was talking about thermal properties. "You believe that," he said finally. "I've tested it," she said. "The stone in my fireplace down below holds heat for hours, Earth has more mass than stone. Amos uncrossed his arms. It still looks like a hole. It is a hole, Mildred said. A very well-designed one. He left without saying whether he thought she was right or wrong. But that evening in the conversations at the general store, where men gathered after the day's work, Amos told people that Mildred Dunmore was doing something strange up on the hillside, and that he was not sure yet whether she was brilliant or about to make a very expensive mistake. That was a more careful assessment than most people were offering. Most people had already decided. The comments came in the way of frontier communities, not maliciously, but steadily, the way water moves under ice. Heard you're moving into a cave, Mrs. Dunmore. You gonna grow mushrooms in there too? Does Cyrus know he's going underground? The children at the trading post asked Alma if she was going to live like a badger. Alma, who was 6 and had more dignity than most adults, told them that badgers were very warm in winter, and she did not see the problem. Mildred heard all of it. She continued working. Augustus Finch, the timber merchant who supplied most of the valley with milled lumber, had been the first person to comment back in August when he rode past and saw her hauling stone. He had called it a hole and ridden on, but there was something that had stayed with him after that day, something he had not told his wife or mentioned at the store. He had recognized Mildred's hands. He had bought lumber from her father, Clifford Webb, 10 years before in Pennsylvania when Finch was first establishing his business. Clifford Webb had mentioned with the particular casualness of a man who was actually very proud that his daughter could build anything he could build. Finch had smiled politely at the time. He remembered smiling. He remembered not believing it. He thought about that smile sometimes in the months after he rode past Mildred Dunmore, hauling stone up a Montana hillside by herself, placing it with a precision and economy of motion that he recognized as something that could not be learned in adulthood. It had to be built into you over years. He did not say any of this to anyone. The dugout was finished in early October. Mildred moved her family in before the first significant snow, which came on the 14th. Alma and Pearl treated the transition as an adventure of the highest order, running their hands along the earth walls, exclaiming at the way the ceiling arched, conducting a thorough investigation of every corner. Pearl found a small stone that she decided had a face on it and carried it in her pocket for the rest of the winter. Cyrus stood in the middle of the space the first evening and was quiet for a long time. Mildred lit the first fire in the central hearth on October 18, 1887. The stone absorbed the heat with the particular patience of material that has been doing this since before human beings existed, and the room temperature climbed steadily and then held. Cyrus sat in his chair and read his book. The girls slept without coughing. That night, very late, Cyrus put down his book and sat without reading for a while. The fire was down to coals. Mildred was already asleep. He was aware in the specific way of men who keep careful track of their own internal states, but rarely announce them, of something he could only describe as the absence of a sound he had been hearing for 2 years, the absence of wind through wall gaps, the absence of the fire consuming itself too quickly, the absence of the low, constant dread of the temperature falling faster than the wood could compensate, just warmth, steady and unearned and present. He did not wake Mildred to tell her this. He knew she already knew, but he sat with it for another hour before he went to sleep in a room that was 49 degrees warmer than the Montana winter pressing down on the 12 inches of sod above his head. 2 weeks later, Alma had not coughed once. Pearl slept through every night. Mildred's notebook recorded interior temperatures that had not dropped below 52 degrees Fahrenheit, even on the nights when the outside temperature fell to single digits. Fuel consumption over the first 2 weeks was 18 pounds of wood. She sat at the table on the last evening of October, opened the notebook, looked at the numbers for a long time, and then closed it. She put out the lantern and went to bed. Outside, the valley settled into the particular silence of a place that has decided what winter is going to mean this year. The cold was building. Nobody in the Bitterroot Valley knew yet how serious it was about to become, but the ground beneath Mildred Dunmore's sleeping family already knew. It had been holding that knowledge for 1,000 years, steady at 53 degrees, waiting for someone who had thought to ask. The cold arrived the way serious things often do, not with drama, with patience. November 14th, 1887, Mildred stepped outside at first light to check the temperature gauge she had mounted on the exterior timber frame of the dugout's front wall. The mercury sat at 18 below 0 Fahrenheit. She stood there for a moment, breathing carefully, because at that temperature, the air had a quality to it that made your lungs object to being used. Then she went back inside, added a single piece of wood to the banked coals, and wrote the number in her notebook. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 22 below. By sunset, it was 31 below, with a wind out of the northwest that had been building for 2 days and now arrived with the specific intention of finding every gap in every structure in the valley and exploiting it. Mildred recorded the evening temperature, closed her notebook, and fed the girls their supper. She did not yet understand that she was recording the opening hours of the longest sustained freeze in recorded Montana Territory history. Nobody in the valley understood that yet. They were still in the phase where cold is something you manage, where the response is to add more wood and pull the blankets tighter and tell yourself it will break in a few days, because cold always breaks in a few days. It did not break. By November 16th, the temperature had not risen above -22. By the 19th, it had settled at -31 and simply stayed there day after day, with the sky above the valley going that particular shade of hard, merciless blue that means the atmosphere has decided something and is not interested in discussing it. The kind of cold that splits standing timber from the inside, the sap freezing and expanding until the trunk cracked like a rifle shot in the middle of the night, sounds that carried across the valley in the frozen air with unsettling clarity. In the timber cabins scattered across the Bitterroot, the calculations that every family had made in October, how much wood, how long it would last, what the margin of safety was, began failing. Fires that had been designed to burn 4 hours on a load now burned through in under 2. Chimneys that had drafted cleanly all through previous winters started backfilling with smoke because the temperature differential between inside and outside had inverted in ways the original builders had not accounted for. Augustus Finch's family burned through 8 cords of wood in 3 weeks. Finch had been a timber merchant long enough to understand exactly what that number meant. 8 cords was what he had planned to sell in January to fund the seed purchase for spring planting. It was now ash. Amos Norwood's chimney cracked on the 21st of November, a thermal shock fracture that sent smoke pouring back into the cabin until he could seal it with a mixture of mud and canvas, working in the cold with hands that kept going numb, with his wife holding a lantern because the smoke had driven out the light. He sealed it. It held. But for 3 days afterward, the cabin smelled of smoke and the interior temperature stayed at levels that made sleep a managed risk rather than a rest. One family 2 miles south of the Dunmore property loaded what they could carry onto a sled and walked their livestock the 6 miles into town, where the hotel had a large central stove and the proprietor had agreed to take in families who could not maintain safe temperatures at home. They were not the last family to make that walk. People stopped visiting each other. The calculation of leaving your home, of exposing yourself to the wind and the cold, of spending the body heat that you needed to stay alive just to travel a quarter mile, meant that the valley contracted. Each family became its own island. You could see the smoke from your neighbors' chimneys and know they were still there, still burning, still enduring. But you did not go to them, and they did not come to you, because the cold had made distance into something that cost real things. Inside Mildred Dunmore's dugout, none of this was the reality. She was awake at 6 every morning. She would check the overnight temperature from the gauge on the interior wall, which had not dropped below 51 degrees on any night since they moved in. She would stir the coals at a single piece of wood, adjust the damper on the small firebox, and then set the kettle to boil. By 7, the interior temperature had climbed back to 60 degrees. By 8, it held at 61, sometimes 62, and that was where it would stay until she banked the fire for the evening. Cyrus had begun keeping his own record of the fuel, not because Mildred asked him to, but because he was a man who found precision useful, and the numbers had started to interest him in a way he had not anticipated. On November 22nd, 8 days into the freeze, he sat down at the table with Mildred's notebook and did the arithmetic carefully. In 8 days, they had burned 31 pounds of wood. He sat with that number for a long time. He had ridden down to the cabin below 3 days earlier to retrieve some tools he had left there, and the cold inside the unheated cabin had hit him with a force that was nearly physical. He had been in that space for less than 10 minutes and had come back up the slope with his hands shaking inside his gloves, the kind of shaking that takes half an hour to stop. That was an empty cabin with no fire at all. But the families in the valley with fires going constantly, multiple fires in some cases, were still cold. 31 pounds of wood, 8 days, and the interior temperature of this dugout had not once required him to put on a coat. He put the notebook down and looked at his wife, who was mending a tear in Pearl's wool coat at the other end of the table. 31 pounds, he said. Mildred looked up. I know. Finch is burning that in a day. More than that now, she said. Cyrus looked at the wall beside him, the bare earth cool to the touch, but not cold, not pulling the heat out of the room the way the cabin walls had done. He understood the physics of it now in a way he had not fully understood in June when Mildred had explained her plan. He understood it because he was living inside the result. "The ground is doing the work," he said. "It always was," Mildred said. "We just stopped asking it to." There was a silence between them that was different from the silences they had in October and early November, when Cyrus was still conducting a private assessment of whether the dugout was working, when he had been careful not to commit too completely to a verdict before the evidence was clear. This silence was different. It was the silence of a man who had arrived somewhere and was taking stock of where he was. He picked up the notebook again. He was going to say something else. What he said instead was nothing, because they heard at that moment the sound of boots on the frozen ground outside, and then a knock at the timber door. It was Henrietta Finch. Mildred had not told Cyrus about Henrietta's first visit 8 days earlier, not because she was keeping something from him deliberately, but because the visit had felt like something that existed in its own category, something that did not require translation into the currency of household information. Henrietta had climbed the slope alone in the early morning without telling Augustus. She had knocked. Mildred had opened the door. Henrietta had stepped inside and stood very still for almost a full minute while the warmth settled around her. She had not said it was remarkable. She had not said Mildred had been right all along. What she had said after that long silence was practical. She had asked about the depth of the excavation, the composition of the stone floor, how Mildred had addressed moisture in the soil at the back wall. She had asked these questions the way a person asks questions when they are not looking for general information, but for specific information that they intend to use. Mildred had answered all of them directly. Then Henrietta had said without preamble, "My children are cold. I need to understand what you've done here." "You're understanding it now," Mildred had said. They had talked for 45 minutes about load ratios and drainage and the specific problem of soil that compresses underweight over time, and how Mildred had addressed it with the Riverstone Foundation. Mildred had not spoken to anyone about the technical details of the construction since Clementine had helped her build it, and there was a particular relief in explaining it to someone who was following every word and asking questions that demonstrated they were following every word. When Henrietta left, she had said one thing at the door: "I won't tell Augustus I've been here. Not yet. He needs to see it himself." Mildred had said, "That seems fair." Now, Henrietta was here again, and this time, the expression on her face was different from the focused information-gathering calm of her first visit. She looked like someone who had been managing something difficult for several days and had reached the limit of how long she could manage it alone. Mildred moved aside from the door without being asked. Henrietta stepped in. She pulled off her gloves and her outer coat, which she had not done on the first visit, and sat down at the table. Her hands, Mildred noticed, were chapped in a way that suggested she had been working with them in the cold more than she should have been, probably because Augustus was burning through fuel faster than he could bring it in, and the task of keeping the fires fed had expanded beyond what one man could handle alone. Cyrus, to his credit, simply said good evening and went to sit with the girls, who were entertaining themselves with a set of carved wooden animals near the back of the room. He understood without being told that this was not a social call. "How bad is it?" Mildred asked. Henrietta looked at the banked firebox. "He's considering going to the hotel in town. The wood is running out faster than he can get more, and what he can get is frozen green timber that burns wrong." Mildred knew about green timber. She had spent one March cutting it. The children, she asked, cold, not dangerously yet, but cold in the way that accumulates. Henrietta looked at her directly. Mildred, he needs to see this, not because I tell him about it. He needs to come here. He knows where I am, Mildred said. He's embarrassed, Henrietta said flatly. He called this a hole to your face in August, and now it's the most functional structure in the valley, and he is a timber merchant. You understand what that costs him. Mildred understood. She had been thinking about it since November 14th, when the serious cold had begun, and she had looked down at the valley and done the arithmetic on every family she knew and what their fuel reserves had looked like in October and what the burn rate of the current temperatures would mean for those reserves. She had thought about Augustus specifically, Augustus who had laughed, Augustus whose business was built on the proposition that timber was the answer to every structural question. He'll come when he's ready, Mildred said. I'm telling you so you're not surprised, Henrietta said. When he comes, and he will come, he won't come easy. She stayed another hour. She drank tea and watched the girls play and did not say anything else about Augustus, and Mildred did not bring it up again. When Henrietta left, she went down the slope the long way, the way that did not pass the general store, the way that meant she was less likely to be seen. Mildred stood at the door and watched her go and thought about what it cost a woman to be useful in ways that her husband could not quite account for. The freeze deepened. On November 27th, the wind that had been intermittent became constant, a sustained flow out of the northwest that drove the already severe temperature into territory that the valley had no previous reference for, -38 with the wind factored in, the kind of cold that moves from being a physical condition into being a presence, something you are aware of at all times, something that is always just outside and always waiting. 3 days later, Pastor Redmond rode up the slope unannounced. Mildred saw him coming and understood immediately what had brought him. Word had reached him that families were traveling up the hillside to visit a woman's home while her husband was present, and in Redmond's understanding of how a valley should be ordered, this required his attention. She opened the door before he reached it. He did not dismount at first. He sat on his horse in the cold and looked at the dugout entrance and at Mildred standing in the doorway without a coat and said, "Mrs. Dunmore, I've heard the families from the valley have been coming here." "They have," Mildred said. "Come inside, Pastor. It's cold." "I'm fine on the horse," he said. But even as he said it, she could see the particular stillness of a man whose body is losing a negotiation with the temperature. "Cyrus is here," she said. "The girls are here. Come inside and say what you came to say." Redmond dismounted. He tied his horse to the post and came through the door with the deliberate manner of a man who has decided to enter a space he had reservations about. The warmth stopped him the way it had stopped everyone. He stood just inside the door and was quiet. Mildred did not help him find his words. She waited. "This is," he began and then stopped. 62 degrees, Mildred said. "The fire has been out since morning." Redmond looked at the thermometer on the wall. He looked at Alma and Pearl on the floor barefoot, playing without coats. He looked at Cyrus, who had put down his book and was watching the pastor with an expression that was polite but not warm. Cyrus stood. He was not a large man, but he was deliberate in his movements, and when he crossed the room to stand beside Mildred, The meaning of it was clear without being stated. Pastor Cyrus said, "Mildred built this. She designed it and she built it, and it's kept our girls warm through 30 days of the worst cold this valley has ever seen. If there's a question about whether families should come here to understand how she did it, I'd ask what the right answer is." He paused. "Is it better they stay in their cold cabins, or is it better they learn what works?" Redmond was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the earth walls. He looked at the sod roof, visible through the ventilation angle. He looked at the thermometer again. "The cold is what it is," he said finally. "And this is what it is." He said it slowly, as though he was arriving at something he had not planned to arrive at. He did not stay long. He accepted no tea. He said nothing more about the families who had visited, but when he left and pulled the door shut behind him, the quality of the silence he left in the room was different from the silence before he arrived. Cyrus looked at Mildred. She looked at him. "He won't say anything against it," Cyrus said. "No," Mildred said. "He won't." She went back to her notebook, but she thought about the way Cyrus had crossed the room to stand beside her and the specific words he had chosen, and she held that quietly for the rest of the evening. The freeze deepened further still. Mildred watched her fuel consumption carefully. The dugout's thermal stability meant that the fire's primary job was no longer to heat a space, but to top off a reservoir. She loaded the firebox twice a day, morning and evening. Everything else the earth and the stone handled without being asked. On the morning of December 3rd, the 20th day of continuous sub-zero temperatures, Mildred was at the table with her notebook when she heard the sound of a horse on the slope outside. She recognized the particular rhythm of it before she saw anything, the careful, slow placing of hooves that meant someone was navigating frozen ground they were not fully certain of. She did not go to the window. She waited. The hooves stopped. There was a long silence, long enough that she had time to write 2 more entries in her notebook before the knock came. A single knock, then nothing, then another single knock, as if the person outside was uncertain whether knocking was the right thing to do. Mildred opened the door. Augustus Finch was standing on the frozen slope with his horse's reins in his hand. He was wearing everything he owned by the look of it, coat over wool, and still his face had the drawn gray quality of someone who had been cold for a long time. He was looking at the thin thread of smoke rising from the chimney above Mildred's head, and his expression was one she had not seen on his face before. It was the expression of a man encountering something that he had decided in advance was not possible, and is now standing in front of the evidence that he was wrong. He looked at her. She was in her shirt sleeves. He looked at her shirt sleeves for a long moment. "How?" he said. That was all. Just the single word stripped of everything except the need to know. Mildred stepped aside from the door. Augustus tied his horse to the timber post she had set in the ground for that purpose and came inside. The warmth hit him, the way warmth hits someone who has been seriously cold, not as a comfort, but as a shock, the body registering the difference before the mind can process it. He stopped just inside the door and stood very still. Mildred let him stand there. She had learned years ago that some information needs to be absorbed at its own pace. After a moment, he pulled off one glove and held his bare hand in the air in front of him, checking it the way you check something You do not quite believe. The air in the room was 62 degrees Fahrenheit. He knew this because Mildred had a thermometer mounted on the interior wall, and he was looking at it now with the focused attention of a man who has been doing mental arithmetic for 3 weeks and has just been given a new set of numbers that changes all the previous calculations. Alma and Pearl were playing on the stone floor, barefoot. Their cheeks were the specific pink of children who are neither cold nor feverish, the pink of children who are simply ordinarily warm and alive and unconcerned. Augustus's oldest daughter had developed frostbite on 2 toes the previous week. He had not told anyone this. He looked at Mildred's daughters for a long moment. Then he looked at Mildred. "The fire," he said, "has been out for 6 hours," Mildred said. He walked to the firebox and pressed his palm flat against the stone, still warm. He understood the mechanism. He was an intelligent man, but understanding it intellectually and standing inside it with his bare hand on warm stone while the temperature outside was -29 were 2 different experiences entirely. "How much wood?" he said, not a question, a calculation being requested. "Half a cord every 2 weeks," Mildred said, "sometimes less." The silence that followed that number was of a specific quality that Mildred recognized. It was the silence of a man doing arithmetic that is producing a result he already knows is going to be difficult to sit with. "My timber," he said quietly. He was not talking to Mildred. He was talking to the room, to the reality the room represented. "I've been selling people timber for years. Every family in this valley built with timber because I sold it to them and told them that was the right way to build." Mildred did not say anything. "And there was another way," he said. "There was always another way," Mildred said. "The earth has always been here." He turned from the firebox and looked at her directly. Augustus Finch was not a man who found humility easy or natural. He had built his business on the confidence of his own expertise, but he was also underneath the expertise and the confidence a man with children, and one of them had frostbitten toes, and he was standing in a room that was 62 degrees because a woman he had called foolish in August had asked the ground what it wanted and then listened to the answer. "I was wrong," he said. "I said this was a hole. I was wrong." "You were," Mildred said. She did not soften it or deflect it or offer him the kindness of being told that anyone would have thought the same thing. He had said what was true, and she confirmed that it was true, and that was the end of that conversation. What followed was different. For the next 20 minutes, Augustus asked questions the way he had probably not asked questions since he was young, without the protective layer of a man who already knows the answers. He asked about the drainage solution for the back wall. He asked about the ventilation channel angles. He asked whether the sod roof required maintenance in spring. Mildred answered everything directly with the particularity of someone who had thought through every variable. When he left, he stood at the door for a moment with his gloves back on and his coat buttoned against the cold, waiting outside. "Henrietta came to see you," he said. "Yes." "Before I did." "Yes." He nodded slowly. He was processing what that meant, the specific sequence of it, the fact that his wife had understood something before he had and had come here to understand it better while he was still maintaining the position that it was a hole. "She's smarter than I give her credit for," he said. "Most people are," Mildred said. He went out into the cold. She heard him untie his horse, heard the slow, careful hooves moving down the frozen slope. She closed the door and stood inside for a moment in the warmth that cost her nothing and had never once this winter made her daughters cry from the cold. Then she sat down and opened her notebook and wrote the date and the temperature and the fuel log entry for the day. That night, Augustus told his wife what he had seen. Henrietta listened without saying, "I told you so," because she was not that kind of woman. What she said instead was, "Who else needs to know?" Augustus said, "Everyone." He told his neighbor the following morning. His neighbor told 2 families at the store. By December 10th, 3 families had ridden up the slope to stand in Mildred's doorway and feel what she had built. By December 12th, there were 6. They came with the same expression Henrietta had worn on her first visit, focused, hungry for information. The expression of people who have been managing a crisis for 3 weeks and have just been told that there was an answer they did not know about. Mildred answered every question. She showed them the fuel log. She let them press their palms against the stone and the earth walls and the inside of the sod roof. She was patient with the ones who kept asking her to explain again, because she understood that the questions were not really about construction. They were about whether it was safe to believe this, whether this was real, whether the thing that looked like a hole in the hillside was actually going to be the difference between surviving this winter and not. Amos Norwood came on December 15th. He came alone in the early morning before most of the valley was moving. Mildred saw him coming up the slope from the south, taking the longer approach, the one that was harder going, but less visible from the main trail. She thought she understood why. Amos was not a man who liked to be seen arriving somewhere he had publicly dismissed. She had coffee on the fire when he knocked. He stepped inside and stood in the center of the room, looking around with the slow, methodical attention of a craftsman assessing another craftsman's work. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the ventilation channels. He crouched by the firebox and studied the dimensions and the chimney draw. He pressed one hand against the floor stone and one hand against the earth wall and held them there simultaneously, feeling the different qualities of cool in each. Then he stood up and looked at Mildred and said, "I told people you were going to tear this down in a year." "I know," Mildred said. "I was wrong about the principle," he said. "I understood what you were trying to do, and I told you it would not work." "You told me the earth would be damp," Mildred said. "It isn't." "No." Amos was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the floor at the river stone laid with care across every inch of the excavated surface. "How did you solve the moisture?" Mildred explained the drainage channels she had cut in the hillside before closing the back wall, the angle she had given the floor to encourage any water infiltration to run toward the front of the space rather than pool beneath the stone. Amos listened to all of it and asked 2 technical questions, both of which were good questions, and Mildred gave him the real answers. Then he said, "Will you let me bring others? Not out of curiosity. People are running out of wood. If this works, and it clearly works, they need to understand why." He paused. He looked at her directly, the way he had not quite looked at her in September, when he had directed his skepticism at the construction rather than at the person building it. "And I want them to hear it from you," he said, "not from me." Mildred studied him for a moment. This was something she had not expected. Amos Norwood standing in her dugout in December with his hat in his hands asking her specifically by name to be the one who explained it. "Bring them," she said. He nodded. He accepted the cup of coffee she offered him and drank it standing near the door, looking out through the small, south-facing window at the valley below, where the smoke from a dozen desperate fires was still rising thick and constant into the merciless blue sky. He left 20 minutes later, going back down the slope the long way he had come up. Mildred stood at the window after he was gone and watched the smoke below for a long time. 14 families came over the next 10 days. They came in ones and twos and sometimes 3 together, and they stayed between 5 minutes and an hour, and every single one of them pressed a hand against something: the stone floor, the earth wall, the cold firebox, verifying with their bodies what their minds were having difficulty accepting. Mildred answered the same questions repeatedly without impatience because she understood that the questions were not really about construction. They were about whether it was safe to believe this. There was a man among those 14 who stood out, though not in a way that anyone would have remarked on at the time. His name was Montgomery Parrish. He was a builder by trade, had come to the valley 2 years before from Ohio with a reputation for solid, fast construction work. He came to Mildred's dugout on December 17th with 3 other men, said almost nothing. The entire visit asked no questions and spent most of his time not looking at Mildred, but looking at the construction, the walls, the roof junction, the firebox proportion, the angle of the ventilation channels. He looked at everything with careful measuring eyes, the way a man looks at something he is planning to reproduce. Mildred noticed. She noted it in the way she noted temperatures and fuel weights, without drama, without immediate action, information. She would need it later. The temperature outside never rose above negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit for 32 consecutive days, from November 14th to December 16th, 1887, the longest sustained freeze in recorded Montana Territory history. Mildred Dunmore's family was warm for every one of those 32 days. Her notebook recorded it entry by entry, temperature and fuel and date and account, written not for posterity, but because she was the kind of person who kept accounts. The valley had survived, but it had survived the way a structure survives a load it was not designed for, with damage that would not fully show until spring. Mildred closed her notebook on the evening of December 16th and looked out the window at a sky that had finally shifted the hard blue, giving way to something grayer and more tentative, the first suggestion in more than a month that the atmosphere was capable of something other than punishment. She thought about Montgomery Parrish's careful measuring eyes. She thought about what she had built and what it cost, and who would remember when spring came exactly who had built it. The thaw came without announcing itself. On the morning of December 20th, Mildred stepped outside and the temperature gauge read 12 below 0 Fahrenheit. After 32 days of negative 25, negative 30, negative 31, 12 below, felt like something the body could negotiate with. She stood on the frozen slope for a moment and breathed without her lungs protesting, and then went back inside to write the number down. 12 below, almost reasonable, almost survivable without strategy. By Christmas, it had climbed to 2 below. By the first week of January, the temperature was pushing above 0 for the first time since mid-November, and the valley began the slow, exhausted process of taking stock of what the winter had cost. The answer for most families was nearly everything. Mildred could see it from the slope. The smoke from the cabins below was thinner now, not because families were warmer, but because many of them had burned through their primary fuel supply and were managing on reserves that had not been intended as primary fuel. Scraps of lumber, furniture that was not strictly necessary. One family had burned their hay barn doors because the alternative was colder. Augustus Finch had sold his seed stock in mid-December, not all of it, but enough that spring planting was going to require either borrowing or a significant recalculation of what they grew. He had made the decision quietly without telling Henrietta until it was done. Henrietta had not said anything when he told her. She had nodded and gone back to the fire. Amos Norwood had lost 3 cattle to the cold animals that he had brought inside the barn and still could not keep warm enough. A hired hand on a neighboring property had taken frostbite on 4 fingers and would lose 2 of them. Mildred knew all of this because people were talking now in a way they had not talked during the freeze, when each family had been sealed inside its own survival. The thaw broke the isolation the cold had imposed, and people came out blinking into the pale January light and began comparing notes with the particular exhaustion of people who have been through something together and are only now able to acknowledge what it was. She knew something else too. She knew about Montgomery Parish. Clementine had told her on the 28th of December, coming up the slope with the direct manner she always used when she had something to say that needed saying. "Parish is building," Clementine said, before she had even taken off her coat. Mildred poured tea and waited. "He's taken a contract from a family over on the East Ridge, Earth Shelter, south-facing slope. He's charging them $40, and he started the excavation 3 days ago." Mildred set the kettle down. "He's a builder. He has the right to build. He watched you for an hour in December and has not mentioned your name once," Clementine said. "The family thinks he designed it. He called it a hillside thermal dwelling, said it was a method he had been refining." The room was quiet. Outside, the January wind moved across the sod roof without finding any way through it. "He has not said your name to anyone," Clementine continued. "Not to his clients, not at the store. He is building 3 more contracts from what I hear. Every family that came to see your dugout in December and then went to ask him to build one." Mildred looked at the table. She looked at her notebook, sitting where it always sat, with 6 months of temperature records and fuel logs and construction notes in her handwriting. "The principle is not mine," she said finally. "Indigenous people built this way for centuries before any of us arrived here." Clementine looked at her steadily. "I know that. You know that. But in this valley, you are the person who remembered. You are the one who dug the first hole and spent a winter proving it worked. And now a man is building his business on that proof, and your name is not part of the conversation." Mildred was quiet for a long moment. Clementine let her be quiet because she was not the kind of woman who rushed someone toward a feeling they had not reached yet. "I'm angry," Mildred said. "Good," Clementine said. "But anger does not warm anyone." Clementine picked up her tea. "No, but it is honest, and I would rather you be honest about it than spend the next 6 months pretending you do not mind." Mildred looked at her. Clementine Haynes was 55 years old, had buried a husband and 2 children, and had lived alone in the Bitterroot Valley for 11 years without ever once pretending that something was fine when it was not. She was possibly the most honest person Mildred knew. "What do I do about it?" Mildred asked. "Nothing dramatic," Clementine said. "You do not need to. Other people will do the dramatic parts. You just need to keep being the person who built the thing." Mildred thought about that for a long time after Clementine left. She thought about it while she cooked supper, and while she helped Pearl with the letter shapes she was learning, and while she lay awake that night listening to Cyrus breathe in the particular slow rhythm of a man who is deeply untroubled, asleep, which was itself a kind of evidence. 3 days later, Augustus Finch went to see Montgomery Parish. Mildred did not ask him to. She did not know he was going until afterward, when he came up the slope with a particular set to his jaw that she associated with a man who has had a conversation that went approximately as well as he expected, and not well enough. He told her what had been said without preamble. He had asked Parish directly whether the families contracting with him knew where the design originated. Parish had said he had not claimed to invent it. Augustus had said that not claiming to invent something and acknowledging who did were not the same thing. Parish had said that the families needed the work done, and he was doing it, and the origin of the method was historical and not proprietary, and he did not see what the problem was. Augustus had told him the problem. He had told him that Mildred Dunmore had spent a summer digging and a fall building and a winter proving, and that every family in the valley had walked up to her door and been given the information freely, and that taking that information into a commercial enterprise without acknowledgement was not a matter of legal ownership, but of something older and simpler. Parish had said he would think about it. "He won't change," Augustus said to Mildred. He was not apologizing for this. He was being accurate. "I know," Mildred said, "but I'm going to tell everyone I talk to," Augustus said. "Every family that asks me about earth shelters, every family that comes to me about the parish contracts, I'm going to say that this started with Mildred Dunmore, that she built the first one and she proved it, and she gave the information to the valley without charging anyone." Mildred looked at him. Augustus Finch had called this a hole. He had laughed quietly with his horse turned away down the trail. He had spent 3 weeks freezing while she was warm, and had finally climbed this slope because he had run out of other options. He was not a sentimental man, and he was not offering this out of sentiment. "You'll do it because it's true," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's why." He went back down the slope. Mildred watched him go and felt something settle in her chest that was not satisfaction exactly and not vindication, but something quieter and more durable than either, the particular feeling of a fact that has been spoken by someone other than the person to whom it belongs. The weeks that followed were the busiest of Mildred's life since the construction itself. Augustus was as good as his word. He told people, Henrietta told people in the different channels, that women use the conversations at the store and the church and the informal gatherings where information moved without the formal structure of a public announcement. By February, the name Dunmore was attached to the method in the way that practical knowledge attaches to its source, not through ceremony, but through repetition, one person telling another, "This is what Mildred Dunmore figured out. This is what she built. This is why it works." 3 families came to Mildred directly independently of Parrish, asking if she would consult on their own construction. She said yes to all three. She did not charge $40. She charged what the materials cost and an afternoon of her time, which was what she considered fair and which was also, she understood, not entirely about fairness. Cyrus went with her to the first two consultations. He held the measuring line and moved the stakes when she needed them moved, and did not offer opinions unless she asked for them, which she occasionally did, because his farmer's instinct for how soil would behave over time was useful in ways that her carpenter's training had not fully accounted for. They worked together in the specific, efficient silence of two people who have been working alongside each other long enough that they do not need to narrate what they are doing. On the way back from the second consultation, walking back up the slope in the pale late January light, Cyrus said without preamble, "You should be charging more." Mildred thought about it. $40 is what Parrish charges. That's why, Cyrus said. She looked at him. He was looking at the trail ahead, not at her. Not to compete with him, he said, because your time is worth what it's worth, not less than his. Mildred said nothing for a moment. Then she said, $20 and materials. Cyrus considered this as though it were a load-bearing calculation. Fair. They walked the rest of the way in silence. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that takes years to build, and Mildred thought, not for the first time, that comfort was underrated as a measure of the quality of something. The formal moment came in early March, when Pastor Redmond organized what he called a spring community gathering at the church, which was a practical event, dressed up as a social one, the valley's way of taking collective inventory after a winter that had tested everyone. People came to report on what they had lost and what they still had and what they needed, and to make the informal agreements about shared labor and shared resources that would determine who could plant what and when. Mildred went and thought it was probably the right thing to do, though she had not attended a community gathering since the previous spring, when she had spent most of it feeling like a piece of furniture that people moved around without acknowledging. This time was different. Before she even sat down, 3 different men came to her specifically to ask questions about construction, not about her construction, but about their own plans, their own slopes, their own drainage challenges. She answered each one the way she always answered questions, specifically and without performance. Redmond opened the gathering with the usual words about community and resilience and the mercy of surviving hard things together. Mildred had heard versions of this speech before. She waited. What came next she had not expected. Redmond stopped in the middle of the standard portion of his remarks and said in the same measured tone he used for everything, "I want to acknowledge something before we move to the practical business of the morning. Several families in this valley are alive and whole because someone in this room built something that worked when everything else was being tested. That person was not a man. She has never asked for acknowledgement, and she will probably be uncomfortable with me offering it now." He looked at Mildred directly. The room looked at Mildred. Mrs. Dunmore built the first earth shelter in this valley and opened her door to every family that came to understand it, Redmond said. She was called foolish for it by some of us who are in this room, including me. He paused. I was wrong. This community is better for what she did, and it's right that we say so." Mildred did not stand. She did not speak. She sat in her chair and felt the specific, uncomfortable warmth of being seen clearly in a public place by people who had previously chosen not to look, and she held it with the same steadiness with which she held everything: the temperatures in her notebook, the weight of a tool, the patience of a season. Cyrus, sitting beside her, put his hand briefly over hers on the bench, just for a moment. Then he moved it away and looked forward again. That was enough.